She agreed to marry a billionaire stranger to save her family, but he already knew her secret. When a struggling pianist agrees to marry a mysterious billionaire to save her family, she never imagines he already knows the one secret she's kept her whole life. Hello everyone! Please subscribe to stay with our billionaire love stories. Comment your country or city. We'd love to see how far these hearts connect. Your support keeps every love story alive for everyone. Now let's dive into today's story of love and fate. It was a cold December morning in Boston, Massachusetts. Snowflakes drifted across the Charles River, and the air carried that sharp winter stillness that felt like the whole city was holding its breath. Inside a tiny music repair shop tucked between two brick buildings, Emma Carter tightened the strings of an old violin. Her hands were steady, but her mind was miles away. The phone on the counter buzzed again. Another call from the bank. Another reminder that the mortgage was overdue. Her father had fallen ill last year, and the shop, once a cozy neighborhood stop for musicians, was now drowning in debt. Emma worked double shifts fixing broken instruments by day and teaching piano lessons in the evenings, but the numbers never added up. She closed her eyes, trying to breathe through the ache in her chest. How did everything go so wrong, so fast? Her mother's favorite piano still sat in the corner, covered with a white cloth untouched since she passed away. Every time Emma looked at it, she felt like a piece of her heart was buried beneath those keys. That afternoon, the shop bell chimed softly. A tall man stepped inside tailored gray coat leather gloves, calm confidence that filled the room. He looked too perfect for this side of town. Miss Carter. His voice was low even, but somehow commanding. Emma straightened, brushing her hands on her apron. Yes, how can I help you? He looked around briefly, eyes landing on the piano, then back to her. My name is Alexander Vale. I believe we met. Indirectly. Emma frowned. I don't think so. Alexander smiled slightly, that kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Perhaps not in person. He handed her a business card, black embossed in silver. Vale Technologies, Boston HQ. Emma blinked. Wait, you're that Alexander Vale. Every news outlet in the state had mentioned him, the elusive billionaire CEO, the man who rarely gave interviews and was rumored to have no personal life. He nodded once, unfazed by her surprise. I'm aware your family is facing financial trouble. I have a proposal. The way he said it made her pulse skip. A proposal. Yes. He met her eyes, his tone steady, unreadable. Marry me for 1 year. In exchange, I'll settle all of your father's debts, and you can continue caring for your family without worry. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than ever. Emma stared at him, searching his face for a hint of a joke. This isn't funny, she whispered. It's not meant to be. She shook her head. Why me? You don't even know me. Alexander's gaze didn't waver. Let's just say, I know enough. His words sent a strange chill down her spine. Before she could respond, he placed a small envelope on the counter. Everything you need to consider my offer is in there. You have 3 days. And just like that, he turned and walked out into the falling snow, leaving Emma standing frozen in the quiet shop, the envelope trembling in her hands. Outside, his black car disappeared down the street, but Alexander Vale didn't look back, because the truth was he already knew exactly who Emma Carter was and what she once did that changed his life forever. 3 days later, Emma found herself standing in the middle of a crowded coffee shop in Cambridge, still unsure why she came. She hadn't called Alexander. She hadn't opened the envelope either, but somehow her feet brought her here, the same cafe where they first crossed paths a week earlier. The smell of roasted beans and cinnamon filled the air. College students typed furiously on laptops, steam curled above paper cups, and Christmas lights blinked softly in the window. Emma joined the line, hugging her coat tighter around her. Her heart was still heavy from that impossible offer. Who just walked into someone's life and suggested a marriage contract, and why her of all people? Next, the barista's voice snapped her back. She stepped forward, ordered a small latte, and as she turned, she bumped right into someone. Hot coffee splashed across her sleeve. She gasped, and her eyes shot up straight into a familiar pair of gray eyes. Alexander Vale. Of course. He was holding his own cup perfectly unbothered, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. Miss Carter, he said smoothly. We really have to stop meeting like this. Emma blinked in disbelief. Are you following me now? No, he said, simply setting his cup down on the counter, but I had a feeling you might come here. Why would I? She demanded. He studied her for a moment, his gaze calm but unreadable. Because people return to familiar places when they're torn between choices. His words hit deeper than she wanted to admit. She looked away, wiping her sleeve with a napkin. "I haven't decided anything," she muttered. Alexander nodded once. "I know." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver coin, placing it gently on the counter between them. "Flip it," he said. "Heads you walk away, tails you hear me out." Emma stared at him, half annoyed, half intrigued. This is ridiculous. Maybe he said, but so is life. Against her better judgment, she picked up the coin and flipped it. Its sponge shimmered in the cafe light, then landed tails. Alexander smiled faintly. "Looks like you'll have coffee with me." And as they sat down by the window, snow began to fall outside, soft, slow, as if the city itself was watching their story begin. 2 weeks later, Emma stood in front of a towering glass building in downtown Boston, the winter sun glinting off the Vail Technologies logo above the entrance. Her heart hammered in her chest as she clutched the envelope, the same one Alexander had left on the counter that day. Inside it was a contract, a real, legal, terrifying contract. She had read it over and over, every clause perfectly worded, every risk clearly stated. A 1-year marriage, a confidential arrangement, no emotional involvement, no interference with personal or business matters. In exchange, Alexander would pay off every cent of her father's debt transfer ownership of the shop back to her family and donate to the local music school her mother once supported. It was absurd, it was insane, and yet it was her only way out. When she entered the lobby, the marble floors gleamed like mirrors. A receptionist greeted her by name as if they'd been expecting her all along. "Mr. Vail is waiting upstairs," she said with a professional smile. The elevator ride felt endless. Her reflection stared back, a woman torn between pride and survival. When the doors opened, Alexander was standing by the window, his back to her, the skyline stretching wide behind him. He turned when she entered. "Miss Carter." "Mr. Vail." Her voice came out quieter than she expected. He gestured toward the leather chair opposite his desk. "Please, sit." She sat the silence stretching between them. "I read the contract," she began. "It's a lot." Alexander folded his hands calmly. "I understand. You don't have to agree, but I want you to know it's a genuine offer. Not pity, not charity." "Then what is it?" His eyes held hers for a moment before he spoke. "Let's just say it's mutually beneficial." He explained that his company was under scrutiny from investors after a family dispute. His uncle, a board member, was questioning his stability and threatening to block an upcoming merger. Having a wife, even a temporary one, would strengthen his image and secure his leadership position. "So I'm just a shield," she asked quietly. "You'd be protected too," he said, "financially, legally, and personally if needed." Emma frowned. "Personally?" He hesitated, then handed her a pen. "I don't expect you to understand now, but you'll be safe, Emma. I promise you that." There was something in the way he said her name, a softness that didn't match his polished composure. She stared at the pen in her hand. The ink shimmered faintly under the office light. Her thoughts raced. If she said no, she'd lose the shop, her father's health would decline, and everything her family worked for would vanish. If she said yes, she'd be tied to a man she barely knew, a man who seemed to know too much about her. Her chest tightened. This wasn't a love story, it was survival. "Fine," she whispered, signing the last page. 1 year. Alexander nodded once. "Effective immediately. You'll move into my home by the weekend. My assistant will handle the arrangements." Emma stood feeling the weight of what she'd done. "I don't belong in your world," she said softly. He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. "Maybe not," he said, "but sometimes the world changes when someone new steps into it." As she left his office, the city lights flickered through the glass walls. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow, delicate, like the universe was warning her that nothing would ever be the same. And for the first time, Alexander watched her go, his expression calm, but his hand clenched slightly because he knew this wasn't just a contract. It was the beginning of something he could no longer control. The following weekend, Emma stood at the gate of Alexander Vail's estate in Cape Ann, Massachusetts. A sleek iron fence stretched across acres of snow-covered land, and beyond it rose a stone mansion that looked more like a museum than a home. Her heart thudded as she followed the driver up the long driveway. Everything about this place whispered wealth, the glass windows, the marble steps, the silence. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and sea salt. The ocean was visible through wide windows crashing against the cliffs below. A housekeeper greeted her kindly, took her coat, and led her upstairs to a guest wing. Emma noticed how quiet everything was. No laughter, no music, just the hum of heating vents. Even her footsteps sounded too loud. That night, she unpacked her small suitcase in a room twice the size of her old apartment. A note rested on the dresser in Alexander's handwriting. Dinner at 7, formal but not for show. At 7 sharp, she entered the dining room. The table could have seated 20 people, but only 2 chairs were set. Alexander stood by the fireplace, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. He looked effortlessly put together, yet there was something lonely in the way he stared at the flames. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. He turned his expression unreadable. "Do what?" "Pretend this is normal." A faint smile touched his lips. "Maybe I'm trying to convince myself that it could be." They ate mostly in silence, the only sound the clink of silverware and the soft crackle of the fire. Emma caught herself studying him, the sharp jaw, the small scar near his temple, the way he always looked like he was thinking 3 steps ahead. After dinner, she wandered into the library. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. She traced the spines with her fingertips, then found a piano tucked in the corner, its keys gleaming under the lamplight. When she pressed one key, the note lingered in the air like a memory. Before she knew it, her fingers moved on their own, playing a melody her mother used to love. She didn't hear Alexander enter until he spoke. "I haven't heard that song in years." Emma startled, her hands freezing on the keys. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." He shook his head. "No, don't stop." He sat down on the couch nearby, listening. For a moment, the house didn't feel cold anymore. When she finished, the silence between them was soft, not awkward. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "Music sounds different when someone means it." Emma smiled faintly. Maybe that's the point. Later, as she prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the window, the ocean stretching beyond moonlight spilling across the cliffs. She felt small and unsure, but also curious. Alexander Vale was a mystery one she couldn't quite figure out. He was cold-controlled, impossible to read, and yet sometimes she saw something human behind his calm. A flash of grief, a glimpse of warmth. In the days that followed, they crossed paths in quiet ways, morning coffee on the terrace, brief smiles in the hallway, conversations that began awkwardly but ended in laughter. One morning when she tripped over the dog's toy near the stairs, Alexander helped her up his hand, steady his tone, teasing for the first time. "Careful, Mrs. Vale. The house already has enough broken things." She laughed. Genuinely laughed, and for the first time since arriving, she didn't feel like a guest or an employee. She felt seen. Outside, the waves crashed against the rocks as if the world itself knew something was shifting. The walls around them, his and hers, were beginning to crack. It had been nearly 2 months since Emma moved into the Vale estate. Winter began to fade, and the ocean outside turned a softer shade of blue, reflecting the quiet rhythm that had grown between them. The house no longer felt like a cage. Alexander was still distant, still precise, but there were moments, small, fragile moments, when she saw the man behind the title. He'd pause at the piano while she played, sometimes just listening with his eyes closed. He'd join her for tea in the garden on rare sunny days, talking about everything except business. Once he even laughed, a deep, warm sound that caught her off guard. Emma didn't know when things had shifted. She only knew that she no longer checked the calendar, counting down the days of the contract. She had begun to care, and that scared her more than anything. One rainy evening, Alexander was called away to Boston for an emergency meeting. He left in his usual composed way, a quick nod, a brief, "Don't wait up." Emma wandered the mansion restlessly after dinner. The sound of the storm outside echoed through the halls, and she found herself drawn to his study, a place he rarely let anyone enter. The door wasn't locked. Inside the room was immaculate, dark mahogany shelves, a roaring fire in the stone hearth, and rows of neatly stacked files on his desk. Curiosity tugged at her. She shouldn't snoop, but her eyes caught one folder near the edge of the desk marked with a simple label, Carter Emma L. Her breath caught. For a moment she froze. Then with trembling hands she opened it. Inside were pages, hospital records, photographs, and articles, a full account of her life. A picture of her at 19 in a hospital gown, pale but smiling. The date matched the year she had donated blood to a little girl injured in a car accident. Emma's hands shook. It couldn't be. A paper clipped to the file read, "Donor Emma L. Carter, blood type match for Lily Vale." Lily Vale, Alexander's sister. Her heart pounded. The memory flashed the emergency call for donors, her rushing across the snow that night to the hospital, never knowing who she had saved. Tears blurred her vision, so he knew. He had known all along. The sound of the storm outside grew louder, and she felt a chill deep in her chest. She had believed him when he said this marriage was mutually beneficial. But now, it felt like she was part of some twisted debt repayment. A voice behind her broke the silence. Emma. She turned sharply. Alexander stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low but tense. Her throat tightened. "I could ask you the same thing," she said bitterly. "You had all of this before you even met me." He stepped closer, eyes flicking to the open file. "I was going to tell you." "When, before or after the contract expired?" "That's not what this is." "Then what is it, Alexander?" she demanded. "A thank you gift, a guilt-driven charity project, because that's exactly what it feels like." His jaw clenched. "No, that's not—" Don't she cut him off, tears falling freely now. "You don't get to play savior and pretend this is real. You found me, you offered a deal, and I was too desperate to see what you were doing." "Emma, listen." "No," she whispered. "I don't know what hurts more, that you knew my secret, or that you made me believe this might be something real." The thunder cracked outside, shaking the windows. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, she took off the thin silver ring he'd given her, placed it on the desk beside the file, and looked at him one last time. "I can't stay here," she said softly. "Not like this." She turned and walked out before he could stop her. Her footsteps echoed down the hall, each one heavier than the last. By the time Alexander reached the front door, the car was already gone, disappearing into the rain-soaked night. He stood in the doorway, drenched and motionless, the storm raging behind him, the sound of the piano still echoing faintly through the empty house. He whispered her name once so quietly that even the rain didn't hear. Boston in early spring was still cold, but the snow had melted into a pale gray drizzle that seemed to mirror Emma's heart. It had been 3 weeks since she left the Vale estate. She was back in her small apartment above the music shop, living among cardboard boxes and old instruments that smelled of varnish and dust. Every morning she opened the shop with her father's help, and every night she played piano at the same small bar in Cambridge where the regulars called her the Quiet One. She was fine, or at least that's what she told herself. She told her father she was working on a music project and avoided any mention of the man who had turned her life upside down. But sometimes when she brushed her fingers across the piano keys, her mind would drift back to the mansion by the sea, to the way the light fell through the tall windows, to the sound of Alexander's calm voice saying her name. She shook it off every time, but the memory lingered like a song that refused to end. At the Vale estate, the silence was different. The walls, once warmed by laughter and music, felt hollow. Even Echo, the golden retriever, had stopped waiting by the piano room door. Alexander spent most nights in his study, working through endless files that didn't need his attention. His assistant noticed the change, the late hours, the untouched meals, the curt replies. The world thought he was fine. He still appeared in the press, still wore the same tailored suits, still gave the same precise answers in board meetings. But when he returned home each night, the sound of the ocean outside no longer calmed him. It mocked him, because the one voice that had brought warmth to the house was gone, and it was his fault. On the third week, he opened the piano room. Dust had already started to gather on the keys. He sat down and pressed a single note. It was flat. He laughed softly, a hollow sound. He remembered her saying once, "Music sounds different when someone means it." He closed the lid gently and whispered, "Then maybe it's better silent." Back in Cambridge, Emma's nights blurred into each other. She played for strangers who never asked her name. But one evening, as she finished her last song, an old woman at the bar approached her and said, "You play like you're waiting for someone to listen." The words hit harder than expected. Emma smiled politely, but when she got home, she sat at the piano again, hands trembling. She played the melody she had written for Alexander, the one she never finished. Each note cracked her open a little more. By the time she reached the final chord, tears were rolling down her cheeks. For the first time, she didn't try to stop them. She realized that she hadn't been angry because he lied. She had been angry because she cared, because despite everything, a part of her still wanted to believe him. Meanwhile, miles away, Alexander stood at his office window, watching the lights of the city flicker below. On his desk sat a small photo, a candid shot of Emma smiling at Echo in the garden. He picked it up and whispered, "I should have told you sooner." Then, almost without thinking, he opened his laptop and made a call. Set up a donation, he said quietly, to the Carter Music Foundation. No name attached. The assistant hesitated. Understood, sir. When the line ended, he stared out at the rain again. The city lights blurred just like the edges of the life he once controlled perfectly. Somewhere out there, a piano played in the night's soft, steady forgiving. And though neither of them knew it, the same melody drifted across the Boston wind, carrying the unspoken truth between two hearts that still listened even in silence. The spring rain in Boston had turned heavier that week, flooding the sidewalks and painting the city in muted gray. Emma sat by the shop window watching the drops race down the glass, her hands still resting on the piano keys. Life had slowly found its rhythm again, or so it looked. Customers came and went, bills got paid, and her father had finally recovered enough to start fixing violins again. But the quiet moments still hurt. The empty moments between songs when her thoughts drifted toward Alexander Vale. She told herself she was over it. She told herself he was part of a past that didn't belong to her anymore. But every time she saw the ocean, she remembered the cliffs and the sound of his voice saying her name like a promise. One Friday morning, while Emma was closing the shop early, her phone buzzed with a local news alert. The headline flashed across the screen. Vale Foundation expands new music scholarship program, named after local artist Emma Carter. Her heart stopped. She read it twice. The article described a new initiative launched by the Vale Foundation funding music education for underprivileged kids. The name was hers. The mission statement used her words, the same ones she'd once said to him, music should belong to everyone. Emma set the phone down, her hands trembling. It wasn't possible. She hadn't spoken to him in weeks. That night, she couldn't sleep. She paced the apartment, staring at the rain streaking down the window. Every drop felt like a question she didn't want to answer. When the knock came, it startled her. But it wasn't Alexander, it was David, his driver. He looked solemn. Miss Carter, I'm sorry to bother you. Mr. Vale was in a car accident near Gloucester. He's in the hospital. The world tilted. Emma's breath caught. He's alive, David said quickly, but it was bad. He was driving back from a charity site. He asked for you. The drive through the storm felt endless. Lightning flashed across the Massachusetts coast, and waves crashed hard against the highway barriers. Emma's heart raced faster than the wipers beating against the glass. When she reached the hospital, the hall smelled of antiseptic and rain. A nurse led her to his room. Alexander lay still, his skin pale against the white sheets. His arm was in a sling, and a thin bandage crossed his forehead. Machines beeped softly beside him, steady, rhythmic, alive. Emma stood at the door for a long time before stepping closer. He looked different, quieter, almost fragile. She noticed the small photograph on the bedside table, a picture of her sitting at the piano with Echo. Her throat tightened. Alexander, she whispered, her voice breaking the silence. His eyes fluttered open slowly, focusing on her face. For a second, he didn't move. Then a faint, tired smile curved his lips. You came, he murmured. She swallowed hard, fighting tears. You should have called. I didn't think you'd want to hear from me, he said softly. His voice was weak, but the warmth was still there. Emma shook her head, trying to steady her voice. Why would you name that scholarship after me? He looked at her for a long moment, then turned his gaze toward the rain streaking down the window. Because you reminded me why I started it all, he said. You gave music meaning again. Emma bit her lip, tears welling. And what about the rest? The lies, the file. Alexander exhaled slowly. I didn't lie. I just didn't know how to tell you that the person who saved my sister was the same person who made me feel alive again. Silence filled the room, not empty this time, but heavy with everything unsaid. Emma reached for his hand. It was warm, steady, real. The storm outside thundered once more, but neither of them looked away. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt something inside her begin to soften, a small, fragile hope flickering back to life. The hospital in Gloucester, Massachusetts was quiet the next morning, the rain having faded into a pale silver fog over the ocean. Emma sat by Alexander's bedside, her fingers loosely wrapped around his. He was awake now, propped up slightly, a faint color returning to his face. The heart monitor beeped softly in rhythm, steady, reassuring. Neither of them had spoken much since she arrived the night before, but the silence between them wasn't sharp anymore. It was calm, heavy, full of unspoken things that finally had a place to rest. When the nurse left the room, Alexander turned his head toward her. His voice was hoarse but gentle. You didn't have to come. Emma gave a small, tired smile. I didn't have to, but I wanted to. He exhaled, looking down at their joined hands. I didn't know how to make things right. Then start by telling me the truth, she said quietly. No contracts, no business, just truth. Alexander's eyes softened, and for the first time he looked completely unguarded. He reached for the small drawer beside his bed and pulled out a folded paper. It was an old photo, a younger Emma smiling faintly taken the night she donated blood years ago. He held it like it was something fragile. I kept this, he said. My sister Lily, she was hit by a drunk driver when she was 11. They said she wouldn't make it through the night. And then a donor came in. You didn't even leave your full name, but your blood saved her. Emma stared at the photo, a lump rising in her throat. I didn't know who she was, she whispered. I saw the news and went. Alexander nodded slowly. I searched for you for years. Not because of guilt, because I wanted to thank you. But when I finally found you, you were working exhausted, trying to save your father's shop. And I didn't know how to approach you without it sounding wrong. So you offered marriage, she said, her voice trembling between disbelief and emotion. I offered a way to help you, thinking I could keep things professional. But then you walked into my life, and it stopped being business. He paused, swallowing hard. I fell in love with you long before you realized who I was. I just didn't have the courage to tell you. The truth hung between them like sunlight breaking through fog. Emma's eyes glistened. All the anger she had carried began to dissolve, replaced by something softer, understanding, maybe even forgiveness. She brushed a tear from her cheek. You're still terrible at saying what you mean. Alexander gave a weak laugh. I'm improving, though. Emma leaned back slightly, exhaling deeply. I was angry because you didn't trust me with the truth, but I think I understand now. You weren't trying to control my life. You were trying to fix something that wasn't broken. He looked at her with a faint, almost boyish smile. And now, she hesitated, then reached for his hand again. Now, I think I'm done running from what's real. Alexander squeezed her fingers gently. The monitor beside him beeped in time with his steady pulse, a sound that suddenly felt like hope. Outside, the fog began to lift, and sunlight spilled across the window, painting the room in gold. Emma rested her head lightly on the side of his bed, her voice barely above a whisper. You know, for a billionaire, you're pretty bad at happy endings. He smiled, his hand brushing her hair. Then maybe this isn't the ending. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat filled the quiet room, real alive and finally honest. Spring turned to summer along the coast of Maine, and for the first time in a long while, life felt steady. Not perfect, not grand, just steady. 3 months had passed since the accident. The newspapers called it the Vail Redemption, praising Alexander Vail for his foundation's expansion, his new charity initiatives, and the launch of a nationwide music scholarship. But for Alexander, redemption wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet mornings spent by the ocean, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, and the sound of Emma Carter humming as she tuned a piano. They had moved into a small beach house overlooking the Atlantic. It wasn't one of his estates or her childhood home. It was new theirs. The days followed a gentle rhythm. Emma taught piano to children from the local school, most of them scholarship students from his new foundation. The laughter of kids and the clumsy notes of beginner songs filled the once silent rooms with life again. Alexander sometimes worked from the study facing the sea, his laptop open but his eyes often drawn toward the shoreline, where Emma walked barefoot in the sand, carrying a basket of seashells, like a girl rediscovering joy. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, she found him outside fixing the old wooden bench near the porch. His sleeves were rolled up, his hands smudged with paint. Never thought I'd see a billionaire with a toolkit, she teased. He smiled, tightening the last screw. Never thought I'd see you stay in one place long enough to call it home. Emma leaned against the railing, watching the orange light ripple across the waves. This feels different, she said softly, like the quiet after a storm. Alexander glanced up at her, the fading sunlight catching the edges of his hair. It's peace, he said. And you brought it here. A gentle breeze swept through, carrying the scent of salt and wild flowers. Inside the piano stood open, its keys reflecting the colors of the setting sun. Play something, he said quietly. For us. Emma hesitated, then sat at the piano and began to play a soft, tender melody that seemed to breathe with the sea. The notes drifted out the open window, merging with the sound of the waves below. Alexander stood behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder as the music swelled. For a moment, there were no debts, no contracts, no ghosts from the past. Only two people who had finally found their way back to the same song. When the last note faded, Emma looked up at him and smiled. So she said, "Does this mean our contract's officially over?" Alexander grinned. "Over no, Miss Carter. I'd say it's just beginning." And as the ocean breeze carried the final echoes of her music into the evening, the house, their home, felt full again. Autumn arrived early in Maine, painting the coastline in amber and gold. The air carried the crisp scent of salt and pine, and the sound of the ocean drifted softly through the open windows of the beach house. Inside, Emma Carter sat at her piano, her fingers tracing the ivory keys as if greeting old friends. A candle flickered on the windowsill, its flame swaying in time with the rhythm of her song. Behind her, Alexander Vail leaned against the doorway, hands tucked in his pockets, watching quietly. It had been nearly a year since the day he asked her to marry him, a deal once born out of desperation and secrets, now transformed into something real, something neither of them could have written into a contract. Emma finished the melody and turned toward him with a soft smile. "Do you ever think about how strange it all was," she asked, "that the whole thing started because of a lie?" Alexander walked closer, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it wasn't a lie," he said. "Maybe it was just a truth waiting to be told." She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "You always find a way to make things sound poetic." He grinned. "That's because you made life sound like music." Emma stood and walked to the window. The waves rolled gently against the rocks below, the same sea that had witnessed their worst fights and their most fragile moments. "I used to think love was supposed to be easy," she said, "but maybe it's not. Maybe it's about choosing to stay even after everything falls apart." Alexander stepped beside her, his arm brushing hers. "That's the only kind worth having," he said softly. They stood together in silence, watching the horizon glow pink as the sun began to set. A small group of children from Emma's music school played outside in the yard, their laughter floating through the air. Each note of their joy seemed to echo everything she'd fought for, a second chance, a life rebuilt, a love reborn from honesty. Emma turned to him, eyes bright with emotion. "You know," she said, "for someone who built an empire out of logic, you're surprisingly good at love." Alexander smiled, pulling her close. "Guess I had the right teacher." The piano behind them sat open, a sheet of music resting on the stand. Across the top, written in her neat cursive handwriting, were the words, "The stranger I loved." As the camera would fade, the ocean shimmering, their silhouettes framed against the sunset, Emma's voice would echo softly. "I married a stranger to save my family, but he saved the part of me I'd forgotten to love." The final note of her song lingered in the air, a whisper of forgiveness, of hope of beginning again. And as the screen darkened, a gentle voice invited,